Haven Arrest Missionary Baptist Church Sunday School Lesson number 13, Sunday, November 25th, 2018. The lesson is entitled Thanksgiving and a Promise. The lesson text comes from Genesis chapter 8, verses 15 through 20. Related scriptures are Isaiah 54, 6 through 10, Philippians 4, 15 through 18. The place is unknown and the time is unknown. In our lesson this week, we learn how Noah remembered to thank God for bringing him and his family safely through the floods. We also learn that God responded with a promise to the whole world that is still true today. Study the lesson to find out more. Today's aim, facts, to show that righteous Noah was also a grateful man. In addition, we see God make a promise to the whole world that is still valid today. Principle: to realize that God's goodness to us demands a response of gratitude. Application: to return to God in gratitude when we experience His goodness. Illustrating the lesson. God's goodness demands our response of thanksgiving to Him. Practical points. 1. Waiting is difficult, but we trust God, who knows the road ahead. Genesis 8:15. 2. Caring for God's creation honors Him. Verse 16. 3. Only God can restore what sin has destroyed. Verse 17. 4. God protects us as we follow His direction and submit to His timing. Verses 18 through 19. 5. As the one who delivers us from our trials, God deserves our worship. Verse 20. 6. Worship leads us to see our sins in the light of God's holiness, grace, and glory. Verse 21. 7. God shows faithfulness to mankind, and believers respond to Him with praise and worship. Verse 22. Golden text. Now Noah builded it an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Genesis 8:20. Today we have two lesson outlines. The first is leaving the ark, Genesis 8:15 through 19, and the second is worshiping God, Genesis 8:20 through 22. Introduction. God remembered Noah. Genesis 8:1 tells us, and a good thing that proved to be. When used of God, the word remember does not imply recalling to mind something that had been forgotten. It speaks of intentionally directing His thoughts towards someone with a view to action. As a result, God did several things for Noah. The first was to send a wind over the earth to cause the waters to abate. After this had gone on for a while, the water was low enough for the ark to settle on the mountains of Ararat. Verse 4. 40 days later, Noah opened the ark's window, verse 6, and sent out a series of birds to see how things were drying out on earth. The raven flew constantly until it could find a place to land. The doves did not have that kind of stamina, however, so the first one returned soon after being sent out, and the second one returned with a fresh olive leaf that showed progress was being made in the drying process. Finally, the cover of the ark was removed, and the ground was seen to be dry. Verse 13. Leaving the ark, Genesis 8:15. And God spake unto Noah, saying, verse 16, Go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife and thy sons wives with thee. Verse 17, Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh, both of fowl and of cattle, and of every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed abundantly in the earth, and be fruitful and multiply upon the earth. Verse 18. And Noah went forth, and his sons, and his wife, and his sons' wives with him. Verse 19. every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth, after their kinds, went forth out of the ark. God's liberating command, Genesis 8:15 through 17. According to verse 13, the surface of the ground was dried by Noah's 601st year in the first month, the first day. By the 27th day of the second month, it was dry enough to be walked on, verse 14. And God told him to exit the ark. So how long had he and his family been in there altogether? The fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven had burst forth on the 17th day of the second month of Noah's 600th year, Genesis 7:11. There had been 1 week wait on the ark before this happened, verse 10. The ancient calendar had 30 days per month, so 1 year would have been 360 days. By adding the 7 days ahead of the flood and the 10 days afterward before they exited, we arrived at a total of 377 days on the ark, amounting to 1 year and 17 days. On that day, God spoke to Noah, telling him to exit with his wife, sons, their wives, and all the animals described as every living thing that is with thee. Chapter 8, verse 17. God added his purpose in having saved all those animals. He wanted them to breed and reproduce abundantly on the earth, to increase rapidly in numbers. At that point in time, there were no living creatures beside the ones exiting the ark. So this was God's reminder that he intended to repopulate the earth with every type of animal. This was a new beginning. God would later threaten to destroy the nation of Israel and start over again with Moses, Exodus 32:7 through 10. Moses interceded with God, and this never happened. God did have a new beginning with Abraham when he called him out of Ur of the Chaldees and told him to leave his country and go to a new place, Genesis 12:1. Noah and Abraham, therefore, both represent new beginnings in the course of human history. Noah's eager obedience, Genesis 8:18 through 19. These verses simply state that everyone and everything left the ark just as God had commanded. We should note that Noah and all with him did not even attempt to exit the ark until God commanded them to do so. He relied totally on God's perfect timing for this next move. Noah had removed the covering of the ark several weeks earlier, verse 13, but he made no attempt to leave at that time. If he had, he would have found the ground dry on the surface but unstable underneath and not safe to navigate. Only God knew when the dry surface was accompanied by dry and solid ground underneath it. We do not know whether Noah was feeling any sense of frustration over having to wait what seemed like extra time. If he was, he did not give in to the temptation to run ahead of God. Waiting on God is often difficult for us, especially when we think about something that needs to be done immediately. Every evidence shows that Noah waited patiently until he received God's assurance, implied in the command to leave, that the ground was safe for him, his family, and all the animals. At this time, God gave some new regulations for mankind, in effect delegating some of his authority to man. The Lord laid down guidelines people were to continue to obey. At this time, they were to obey human authorities that he would place over them. Those guidelines are specified in the Noahic covenant in Genesis 9. This first major change was to permit the eating of certain animals under certain regulations, verses 1 through 4. Prior to this, the diet had been strictly vegetarian for both man and beast. The second major change was related to the shedding of blood. No flesh was ever to be eaten with the blood, verse 4. But God extended the principle to the shedding of the blood of people by other people, verses 5 through 6. Transgressors would be held accountable by a strict penalty. At the hand of every man's brother will I require the life of man. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. Here we see the establishment of human government and the delegation of some of God's authority to man. This is the beginning of what Paul would later explain in Romans 13, 1 through 7, where he wrote that we are to be subject to those in authority over us. Jesus also spoke of this in Matthew 22:21. Worshiping God. Verse 20. And Noah builded an altar unto the Lord, and took of every clean beast and of every clean fowl, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. Verse 21. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done. Verse 22. While the earth remaineth seed time and harvest, and cold and heat, and summer and winter, and day and night shall not cease. An altar. Genesis 8:20. This is the first altar mentioned in the Bible, and the fact that Noah offered burnt offerings on it indicates an act of worship. Many of the Old Testament saints built altars, so this was the beginning of what became a regular worship practice from then on. There is no record that God instructed Noah to do this, but it seems likely that some kind of instruction had been given for this worship practice, and it might well be that the information was verbally passed on to later saints. Early altars were probably made with stones supporting an elevated flat top on which offerings were placed and sacrifices were made. Archaeologists have discovered altars used by pagan religions, showing that it eventually developing into a universal practice after Noah's time. Abraham also built altars to the Lord. Concerning his first one, Genesis 12:7 says, And the Lord appeared unto Abram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And there builded he an altar unto the Lord, who appeared unto him. A short time later he built another altar, and he removed from thence unto a mountain on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, having Bethel on the west and Hai on the east, and there he builded an altar unto the Lord, and called upon the name of the Lord. Verse 8. His most difficult one to build, however, was the one on which he thought he was going to sacrifice his son Isaac. Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him on the altar upon the wood. 22:9. One of the most notable accounts of an altar concerned the one Jacob built to offer sacrifices while on his way to Egypt. Genesis 46:1. God responded by reassuring him that it was his will for him to go to that foreign land. This incident reveals that through the use of an altar, these men were connecting directly with God in their worship. At Mount Sinai, God gave specific and detailed instructions about the building of altars and their use. After Noah built his altar, he offered burnt offerings of all the clean animals and birds. It is not until Leviticus 1 that we read the instructions for burnt offerings. However, how much Noah had been instructed about the practice, we are not told. Neither are we told how we knew which creatures were clean and which were not. Noah's relationship with God evidently was so close and meaningful that somehow he knew what was pleasing to him. A soothing aroma. Genesis 8:21. The statement, "the Lord smelled a sweet Savior," indicates that God took notice, was pleased with Noah and his offering, and fully accepted his attention and worship. This act of worship on Noah's part was an expression of gratitude to God for the way he had taken care of them. God's response, therefore, was not simply acceptance of Noah's act of sacrificing, but pleasure in his heart's attitude, which was even more important. God will always be pleased with our worship. We should note, however, that Noah offered him the best that he had, and this should remind us to do the same. When God established the sacrificial system later with Moses, he saw to it that those who served him received the best the people had to offer. They were to offer to the Levites the best from their crops and animals, who in turn gave a tenth of the best of those offerings to the priest, who in turn gave a tenth of the best of those offerings to the high priest. God always deserves our best, not our leftovers. That is one reason we are taught to give the first of our income to him before spending it on other things. It is also why we are to see that his servants are well cared for. Have you ever noticed that the churches that receive the richest blessings from God seem to be the ones that take the best care of their pastors and missionaries? When we care for his servants, we are offering God our best. He in turn responds as he smells the sweet savor of our sacrifices. God was so moved in his heart by Noah's offerings that he made a promise to himself. "I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake. For the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more everything living as I have done." Genesis 8:21. Perhaps the most amazing part of this promise is that he would never again totally destroy mankind, even though he knows his heart is continuously evil. That is great mercy in action. God had cursed the ground when Adam sinned, and again indirectly when Cain sinned, and was cursed by God. Genesis 3:17 through 19, 4:12. His promise here not to curse the ground again probably refers to not destroying it again with water. Genesis 9:11 specifically states, "Neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there any more be a flood to destroy the earth." In later days, God punished his people for their sins, but he has never again used a universal flood to do so. Natural catastrophes do happen today, making us wonder whether they are sometimes God chastening. Even since the flood, length of life was decreased, oceans were more extensive and therefore habitable, land was reduced. There was a greater variation in climate. The crust of the earth was now unstable and subject to seismic activity. Hurricanes, tornadoes, and thunderstorms would now buffet the earth, and local floods and ocean surface would also cause destructions. A covenantal promise, Genesis 8:22. In spite of the recurrence of various natural disasters, no flood has ever again destroyed mankind. In fact, God accompanied his thoughts with the assurance that as long as the earth remains, there will continue to be cycles in which there will be planting and harvesting, cold and heat, winter and summer, and day and night. After the flood, major changes occurred, but God was not going to allow them to destroy mankind. This statement is in the form of a poem, somewhat similar to Genesis 12:1 through 3. and might have become a song in later days. Since the flood had totally disrupted everything normal about life, this reassurance that it was not going to happen again was a guarantee that mankind would continue and would be able to survive. Warren Wiersbe encourages us with these words. The guarantee in Genesis 8:22 gives us hope and courage as we face an unknown future. Each time we go to bed for the night or turn the calendar to a new month, we should be reminded that God is concerned about planet Earth and its inhabitants. While the invention of the electric light and modern means of transportation and communication, our world has moved away from living by the cycles of nature established by God. We no longer go to bed at sundown and get up at sunrise. And if we don't like the weather where we are, we can quickly travel to a different climate. But if God were to dim the sun, rearrange the seasons, or tilt the earth at a different angle, our lives would be in jeopardy. Even in natural hardships around us, we can trust God to care for us without fail. In closing, hear the words of Isaiah. For this is as the waters of Noah unto me. For as I have sworn that the waters of Noah should no more go over the earth, so have I sworn that I would not be wroth with thee, nor rebuke thee. For the mountains shall depart, and the hills be removed, but my kindness shall not depart from thee, neither shall the covenant of my peace be removed, saith the Lord that have mercy on thee. Isaiah 54, 9 through 10. Questions. 1. How old was Noah when the flood began, and how old was he when it ended? 2. How long had Noah and his companions been in the ark? 3. Who besides Noah represents a new beginning in history? 4. Why was it important not to exit the ark before God gave the command to do so? 5. What can we learn from the fact that Noah patiently waited for God's command? 6. Why did Noah build an altar, and what did he do with it? 7. What did Noah offer to God on his altar? 8. How did God respond to Noah's offerings? 9. What did God promise himself upon seeing Noah's offerings? 10. What assurance did God make regarding man's future? This concludes the Sunday School lesson for Sunday, November 25th, 2018. Thank you for listening. God bless.